the migration of peoples was a universal phenomenon practiced by people with non-white skins before white-skinned people from Europe started to do it. That's the context. So before we talk about what Arthur Phillip was doing when he landed in Sydney Cove in 1788, just bear in mind that in the 1600s, the Iroquois in North America had expanded north, overwhelmed the Huron, and sent other North American peoples scattering to the west. In the 1700s, the Comanche overwhelmed the Apache and established a vast slave economy in the southwest of what's now the US. In South Africa, the Zulu expand westward and then scatter other African peoples even further westward in what's now referred to as the Imfakani, or the crushing. In other words, and also, yes, sometimes when one culture encounters another, or white settlers encounter Aboriginal peoples, there was misunderstanding, mistrust, and conflict. But there was also fascination. So in the early days of the settlement at Sydney Cove, some Aborigines come into the settlement because they're fascinated, yes. partly because the supply of food is more ready. And then Bennelong, I think, tried to persuade Arthur Phillip and the settlers to become allies of his in a fight against other Aboriginal peoples. And sometimes the two cultures were just fascinated with one another. So it's entirely wrong to portray the relationship of white settlers to Aboriginals as one of conflict and opposition. It wasn't. It was a mixture.
Right here where we're sitting was on the interface of some quite serious disagreements, old-timers used to tell my father and my grandfather, between local groupings. And indeed, I told the story, it's a quite closely recorded history, of the Red Chief, the local leader here, to a group of school students a couple of years ago, only to discover that two girls in particular were quite traumatised. They wanted to know why I had described as a hero someone who had, acceptably in the customs of their time, but nonetheless had in reality abducted two young girls from a neighbouring tribe and then murdered one of the girls' fathers when he came out to try and rescue his daughter. Now, two of these young ladies were quite traumatised. Why is he seen as a hero? They are terrible things to do. In many other ways, he was a wonderful leader of the local tribe, and you can see why he's revered to this day. But doesn't it tell a story that we ought to be very careful about judging others, that the dividing line between good and bad is a lot more nuanced?
No, absolutely. And I think, again, when we think about the past, we do need to get out of our 21st century skins. I mean, we in Britain and you in Australia, right now, we live in societies that enjoy unprecedented wealth, health, and security. And so it's if we assume that the rest of the world in the past should be like us, then it's very hard for us to understand why people had recourse to violence so readily in the past. It's only when we realize that if we lived in similar circumstances, let's say on a frontier where there's no strong state to regulate our encounter with strange peoples, if we were in those circumstances, we would have our musket at our side, ready to defend ourselves. So we've got to get out of our own shoes and use a bit of imagination. You mentioned this fellow who was partly heroic, but partly did things we might disapprove of. And my view of that, John, is as a Christian, I don't expect even saints to be perfect. So if we're going to have heroes, we've got to settle for flawed heroes. Take this example. Martin Luther King, deserved hero of the civil rights movement in America. If you go into Washington, D.C. and walk around to the south side of the lake called the Basin, a very monumental monument to MLK there. And we celebrate him for his heroic action in the 1950s in favor of civil rights. We don't celebrate him because he was a serial adulterer, which he was, right? So all of our heroes are flaws. We put up statues not to say everything this guy did was right, but because he did something that was really a major human achievement. So we need to be a bit forgiving about our heroes. They were flawed, but some of them achieved remarkable things. One thing that needs to happen when we discuss our colonial history in public is we do need to set these things in context.